One of the biggest mistakes I think people make when trying to understand difficult relationships is assuming that the answer lies in identifying the right label for the other person. Is this manipulation, insecurity, trauma, narcissism? Those questions often become distractions from something that is actually observable, which is their behavior. Today, I want to look at something different. Instead of asking who someone is, I want to ask what a particular behavior is accomplishing. Because behavior has a function, whether that function is conscious or unconscious, intentional or habitual, it still serves a purpose. And if we begin observing the function instead of chasing labels, patterns become much easier to recognize. One pattern I've observed repeatedly is that language can sometimes create the appearance of accountability without producing the reality of accountability. Accountability is not demonstrated by saying the right words, it is demonstrated by sustained behavioral change over time. For example, someone may apologize, and an apology can absolutely be genuine, but an apology by itself is not evidence of repair. If the same behavior continues, then the apology has functioned as language, not as change. The same principle applies to self awareness. Someone may actually describe their own patterns. They may tell you exactly why they reacted the way that they did, explain their childhood, identify their fears, and they may even predict what they're likely to do next. And insight is a valuable thing to have, don't get me wrong. Understanding ourselves is extremely valuable. But insight and change are not the same thing. Sometimes explanation becomes a substitute for transformation. The conversation shifts from what is changing to look how well I understand why I did it. And those are not equivalent. Another pattern involves displays of personal growth. Someone may begin talking about therapy, journaling, psychology books, emotional intelligence, or healing, and all of those things are, of course, incredibly beneficial. The question isn't whether someone is reading the books or understanding the language or the terminology. The question is whether the behavior is actually changing. Knowledge is not evidence, behavior is. Sometimes people also redirect attention toward their own suffering immediately after they've caused harm. Instead of remaining focused on the impact of their behavior, the conversation moves toward their stress, their fear, their shame, or their circumstances. Those experiences may be completely real, but they can also have the effect of moving the emotional center of the conversation away from the original issue. Without realizing it, the other person may find themselves providing comfort before accountability has ever occurred. Another observable pattern is when someone begins criticizing themselves before anyone else has the opportunity to even address what happened. They may call themselves selfish or even describe themselves as manipulative. At first glance, this appears to be radical honesty, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it changes the role of the listener. Instead of evaluating the behavior, the listener now feels compelled to reassure the speaker. The conversation moves from accountability into emotional rescue. And again, notice that we're not assigning motives. We're simply observing what happens next. What effect did the communication have? Where did the attention go? Did the discussion stay focused on repairing harm, or did it become focused on managing emotion? The same approach applies to romantic language. Expressions of love are not evidence of relational health. Promises about the future are not evidence of relational stability. Powerful emotional language can coexist with repeated behavioral inconsistency. That doesn't mean that the feelings are fake, it just means feelings alone cannot answer the question of whether a relationship is functioning well. Behavior answers that question far more reliably than emotion does. Throughout all of these examples, one principle remains consistent. Words matter, intentions matter, but behavior carries the greatest evidentiary value. When words and behavior consistently align, trust naturally develops. When they repeatedly diverge, confusion usually follows. One of the healthiest transitions we can make is learning to observe patterns over isolated moments. Anyone can have a good day, say the right thing, or produce an insightful explanation. The more important questions are what happens consistently across time. What happens after the conversation ends? Does accountability produce measurable behavioral change, or does it repeatedly produce another conversation? These questions have helped me understand relationships far more accurately than any personality labels ever could have. Because ultimately, this isn't about deciding what someone is, it's about observing what's actually happening. And when we become better observers of behavior, we become less dependent on assumptions, which really we should not be making anyway, right? We become less vulnerable to confusion and become much better equipped to distinguish between language that sounds like change and behavior that actually produces change. That distinction may be one of the most valuable tools we can develop, not just for understanding other people, but for evaluating ourselves as well.